On a sweltering August afternoon in 1867, 8-year-old Fanny Adams was abducted from a Hampshire hop garden and murdered, a crime so shocking it would transform a quiet market town into national infamy and etch the victim's name permanently into the English language. The case represented a collision of Victorian innocence with unthinkable depravity, featuring methodical police work, primitive forensics, a damning diary entry, and the last public execution at Winchester Prison. Within 2 years, Royal Navy sailors would mockingly name their tinned rations after the dismembered child, creating the phrase "Sweet Fanny Adams" that endures today as British slang for nothing at all. Before we dive into this haunting case from Victorian England, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss our cold case investigations. And if you appreciate the research that goes into these documentaries, consider liking this video. It really helps us continue bringing you these stories. The Fanny Adams case shattered Victorian assumptions about respectability, community safety, and childhood innocence, while demonstrating both the capabilities and severe limitations of 1860s investigative methods. From Frederick Baker's chilling diary confession to his Christmas Eve execution before 5,000 spectators, this case offers a complete narrative arc, encompassing murder, investigation, trial, execution, and lasting cultural impact. Alton, Hampshire, was an unremarkable market town of approximately 4,000 souls in 1867, built around hop growing and brewing. The town had seen no serious crime during the entire 19th century. Residents would later emphasize that nothing of consequence ever happened there until August 24, 1867. That Saturday afternoon was exceptionally hot and sunny. George Adams, a 32-year-old bricklayer, left his home on Tanhouse Lane to play cricket for the church bell ringers against the village band at the Butts. His wife Harriet stayed home doing laundry and housework while their children played nearby. The couple had 6 children. Their eldest daughter was Fanny Adams, born April 30th, 1859. Contemporary newspapers described Fanny as a tall, comely, and intelligent girl who appeared older than her 8 years and 4 months, known locally for her lively and cheerful disposition. Around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Fanny asked permission to play in Flood Meadow with her 7-year-old sister Lizzie and best friend Minnie Warner, age 8, who lived next door. Harriet Adams agreed, pleased to have the children occupied while she worked. The meadow lay approximately 400 yards from their home, adjacent to the hop garden of Amory Farm, a distance considered safe in that close-knit community. The 3 girls never imagined that afternoon would end with one of Victorian England's most horrific murders, an investigation featuring cutting-edge forensics, and a defendant whose own diary would seal his fate. Frederick Baker was 29 years old, a solicitor's clerk employed by William Clements in an office on Alton High Street opposite the Swan Hotel. He had moved from Guildford approximately 12 months earlier. On paper, Baker represented Victorian respectability. He wore the professional uniform of black frock coat, light-colored waistcoat and trousers, and a tall hat. His position as a solicitor's clerk placed him in the lower middle-class professional ranks, not genteel, but certainly respectable. Yet Baker carried dark currents beneath this respectable surface. His father had shown an inclination to assault, even to kill, his children with homicidal mania. A cousin had been committed to asylums 4 times. His sister had died of brain fever. Baker himself had attempted suicide after a failed love affair. These details would emerge only during his trial, when his defense team desperately argued hereditary insanity. Around 1:30 in the afternoon on August 24th, the 3 girls encountered Baker in or near Tanhouse Lane as they walked toward Flood Meadow. What happened next would be reconstructed through the testimony of 2 traumatized child witnesses. Baker greeted them and gave them money, 3 halfpence to Minnie and Lizzie to share, 1 halfpenny to Fanny. He offered to pick berries with them. The girls, delighted by the pennies, accompanied him to the Hollow, a sunken section of old road leading to Shalden Village, where they gathered hedgehaws for perhaps 30 minutes. Then Baker told Minnie and Lizzie to go spend their money on sweets. He offered Fanny another twopence if she would accompany him. When she refused, he picked her up bodily and carried her into the hop garden. Minnie heard Fanny cry out that her mother would be calling her and she wanted to go home. That was the last time anyone heard Fanny Adams alive. Around 1:45 or 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Eliza White, crossing the meadow, heard a sound such as a child would raise when caught hold of in play from the direction of the hop garden, likely Fanny's final moments. Shortly after 2 o'clock, a young boy witnessed a horrifying sight. Baker, emerging from the hop garden with his hands and clothes saturated with blood. The witness saw Baker stoop to the river way, wipe himself with a handkerchief, and place a small knife and another object in his jacket pocket before walking calmly away. Minnie and Lizzie, unaware of the horror that had unfolded, played together until around 5 o'clock in the afternoon when they returned home. Mrs. Gardner, a neighbor, asked where Fanny was. Upon hearing the story, she and Harriet Adams rushed to search, encountering Baker himself, returning from the direction of the hop garden near the gate, separating it from Flood Meadow. Mrs. Gardner confronted him directly. "What have you done with the child?" Baker replied calmly, "Nothing," claiming he had only given money to the children for sweets, which I often do. His respectable appearance and professional position initially deflected suspicion. Mrs. Gardner threatened to give him to the police, but they let him go, a decision that would haunt them. Baker returned to his office around 6 o'clock in the evening, where colleague Maurice Biddle found him disturbed. Baker described the confrontation with Mrs. Adams, and Mrs. Gardner then made a chilling observation. "It will be very awkward for me if the child is murdered." Later, at the Swan Pub, Baker mentioned he might leave town Monday, adding cryptically, "I could go as a butcher." Between 7 and 8 o'clock in the evening, with Fanny still missing, Harriet Adams organized a search party of neighbors. They combed the hollow without success. Then Thomas Gates, a laborer and Crimean War veteran who had participated in the charge of the Light Brigade, made a discovery that would traumatize him for life while tending crops in the hop garden. He found Fanny's head stuck on 2 hop poles, her eyes gouged out, her face barely recognizable. Gates collapsed to the ground in shock. What followed was a scene from Nightmare. Scattered throughout the hop garden were pieces of an 8-year-old child, hacked and torn into approximately 20 fragments. 1 foot remained in its shoe, 2 halfpence Baker's payment still clutched in the hand. The Leathern Bottle Pub on Amory Street became an impromptu collection point for body parts. All through that evening and the following day, hundreds of searchers combed the area. They found arms separated from the trunk, legs severed at hip and knee, internal organs scattered across the field. Her clothing, white pinafore, red wool underskirts lay ripped to shreds. Her brown velvet hat was discovered in the middle of a hedge. Crucially, they found a large stone bearing blood, long hair, and a small piece of flesh, the probable murder weapon. Fanny's heart and breastbone were never found. When Harriet Adams learned the truth, she tried to run to the cricket match to tell her husband, but collapsed. Messengers were sent instead. George Adams seized his loaded shotgun to hunt the murderer, but neighbors disarmed him and sat with him through the night as the body parts were taken to Dr. Lewis Leslie's surgery at 16 Amory Street, where they would be sewn back together for post-mortem examination. Superintendent William Shaney of Hampshire Constabulary moved swiftly. By 9 o'clock in the evening on August 24th, approximately 7 hours after the murder, he arrived at the solicitor's office on High Street and arrested Baker, who was working unusually late. Baker's first words, "I know nothing about it." A large, hostile crowd had gathered outside, threatening to lynch the prisoner. Police smuggled Baker out the back door as cries of "Lynch the villain" echoed through the streets. At the police station, Baker was searched and ordered to undress. Officers found blood spots on both wristbands of his shirt, which had been folded back with diluted blood in the folds. His trousers appeared recently washed. His left trouser leg, left stocking, and left boot were soaking wet. The right trouser leg was damp. Small traces of diluted blood marked his waistcoat, trousers, and stockings. When questioned about the blood stains, Baker could provide no explanation for their presence. He claimed the wet clothing meant nothing, saying it proved nothing, as he was in the habit of stepping into the water when he went out for a walk. Asked specifically about the blood, Baker responded with remarkable nonchalance. "Well, I don't see a scratch or cut on my hands to account for the blood." Then came perhaps the most incriminating spontaneous statement. "That won't hang me, will it?" Police found 2 small, unstained knives in Baker's possession. One contained a small amount of coagulated blood, though none on the handle. Timeline verification through multiple witnesses confirmed Baker had left his office shortly after 1 o'clock in the afternoon, returned at 25 minutes past 3, then went out again until 5:30, precisely the window when Fanny was murdered and dismembered. But the most damning evidence came on Monday, August 26th, when Superintendent Cheney searched Baker's office desk using keys taken during arrest. Hidden among legal papers was Baker's personal diary. The entry for Saturday, August 24th, consisted of a single, devastating sentence. 24th August, Saturday, killed a young girl. It was fine and hot. When confronted with the diary, Baker confirmed it was his handwriting, but claimed he had been intoxicated and meant only that he was aware a girl had been murdered, not that he had killed her. This explanation convinced no one. The casual matter-of-factness of the entry, noting the pleasant weather alongside the murder, struck observers as evidence of either cold-bloodedness or profound mental disturbance. If you're finding this investigation compelling, please take a moment to hit the like button and leave a comment below telling us what you think about this case. Your engagement helps us continue bringing you these deep-dive historical investigations. The Fanny Adams investigation showcased both the emerging capabilities and severe limitations of Victorian policing in 1867. Hampshire Constabulary had been established only 28 years earlier, in 1839, following the County Police Act. The force remained small and largely reactive. Record-keeping was minimal, many crimes went uninvestigated, and there was no standardized national detective system. Yet Superintendent Cheney demonstrated methodical investigative work within these constraints. He conducted systematic witness interviews, verified the suspect's movements through multiple sources, secured physical evidence, and crucially consulted with the leading forensic expert of the era. In late October 1867, Cheney sent all recovered clothing and both knives to Professor Alfred Swain Taylor at Guy's Hospital in London, known as the father of British forensic medicine. Taylor's forensic analysis proved groundbreaking for 1867. He confirmed the blood on the knives was human, not animal, a significant capability before DNA analysis existed. He examined coagulation patterns and dilution in the blood-stained clothing. Critically, Taylor opined that the small knives found in Baker's possession were insufficient to have dismembered Fanny's body. Another weapon must have been used, though police searched for 16 days and never found it. Taylor estimated that an inexperienced person with proper tools could dismember a body in approximately 30 minutes. Dr. Lewis Leslie, Alton's divisional police surgeon, conducted the post-mortem after sewing the recovered body parts back together. His findings were horrific in their specificity. The head had been severed with 2 large cuts from mouth to ear across the temple. One ear was torn off. Both eyes had been gouged out and thrown in the River Wey. 3 incisions marked the left side of the chest. A deep cut divided the muscles of the left arm. The forearm was cut off at the elbow joint. The left leg nearly severed at the hip joint. The left foot cut off at the ankle. The right leg torn from the trunk. The torso split open. All organs removed from the pelvis and chest and scattered. 5 incisions on the liver. The heart cut out. The vagina missing. Leslie determined the ultimate cause of death was a crushing blow to the head with the bloodied stone. Fanny had died instantly from blunt force trauma. The dismemberment occurred after death while the body was still warm. The body had not been cut cleanly, but hacked and torn to pieces in what must have been a frenzy. Importantly, Leslie found no evidence of sexual assault, though the missing lower torso portions made definitive conclusions impossible. The investigation's limitations reflected broader Victorian forensic constraints. Fingerprinting would not be used in British courts until 1902. crime scene photography was only emerging. Most critically, hundreds of searchers trampled the hop garden on August 24th and 25th, inadvertently destroying evidence. Victorian investigators had no concept of crime scene preservation. Bodies were often moved to nearby pubs for public viewing, evidence was handled without protocols, and chain of custody did not exist as we understand it today. Yet within these constraints, the investigation succeeded. The combination of eyewitness testimony, timeline verification, physical evidence, and especially the diary entry created what the prosecution would call a chain linked, so firm as to render it impossible for the person around whom it was formed to escape. The inquest convened Tuesday, August 27, 1867, just 3 days after the murder, at the Duke's Head Inn on Butts Road, Alton. Deputy County Coroner Robert Harfield presided, with Superintendent Cheney and Acting Chief Constable Superintendent Everett representing Hampshire Constabulary. A jury of 12 men viewed Fanny's reassembled remains before proceedings began, a standard but traumatic requirement of Victorian inquests. The burden of testimony fell heavily on 2 8-year-old girls who had witnessed their friend's abduction. Minnie Warner testified first. Under the eyes of a courtroom packed with spectators staring through windows and talking loudly, she became unnerved and could not identify Baker. However, she correctly described his clothing in precise detail: black frock coat, light-colored waistcoat and trousers, tall hat. She told the jury about the money Baker gave them, how he picked berries with them in the hollow, how he sent her and Lizzie away, and how she heard Fanny cry out as Baker carried her into the hop garden. 7-year-old Lizzie Adams corroborated Minnie's account, confirming the meeting with Baker, the money for sweets, and seeing him carry Fanny away. The girls had run to tell Minnie's mother, who initially dismissed their story as childish fancy, a decision that haunted her afterward. Mrs. Jane Gardner provided crucial testimony about confronting Baker around 5 o'clock in the afternoon near the gate to the hop garden. She recounted their exchange verbatim. "What have you done with the child?" Baker's response, "Nothing." When pressed about giving money to the girls, Baker claimed, "No, I did not. I gave her 1.5 pence to buy some sweets, which I often do to children." That phrase, "which I often do to children," would resonate ominously. Mrs. Gardner admitted Baker's air of respectability and his position as a solicitor's clerk deflected her suspicions, though she threatened to give him to police. Baker replied coolly, "You may do as you like." Harriet Adams testified about the events of August 24th, her growing concern, the search, and the terrible discovery. George Adams, nearly heartbroken, gave his brief testimony in much grief, formally identifying his daughter's remains. When Baker was brought in and placed on a sofa behind the coroner, George looked at him and later would frantically exclaim, "You are a villain!" Baker reportedly remained unmoved. A controversial witness emerged 2 months after the murder. Alfred Vince, a young boy, claimed he saw Baker emerge from the hop garden around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, with hands and clothes saturated with blood, then watched Baker stoop to the river and wipe himself before pocketing a knife. Vince had told his mother at the time, but she only came forward months later, in a pub. At trial, Vince admitted his mother had taken him to Winchester Gaol for an identity parade, where Baker stood apart wearing a tall hat, and she had nudged him to identify, "That's the man," significantly undermining his credibility. The coroner asked Baker if he wished to say anything. His response, "No, sir, only that I am innocent." The jury deliberated briefly and returned a verdict of willful murder against Frederick Baker for killing and slaying Fanny Adams. Baker was detained at the Duke's Head for 2 hours until the crowd calmed, then smuggled out the back door as the mob attacked the police escort with sticks, stones, and missiles. Frederick Baker stood trial Thursday and Friday, December 5th and 6th, 1867, at the Great Hall of Winchester Castle, before Mr. Justice Mellor. Montague Barry led the prosecution. Samuel Carter defended Baker. The trial occurred just over 3 months after the murder, typical Victorian efficiency in capital cases. The prosecution presented substantial circumstantial evidence. Witness testimony from the inquest repeated the blood-stained clothing, the knives with human blood, Baker's timeline placing him at the scene during the murder window, his wet, bloodied clothing, his suspicious statements to Biddle about it being awkward if the child was murdered and that he could go as a butcher, and most damningly, the diary entry. Barre acknowledged there was no direct evidence, no one actually witnessed the killing, but argued the circumstances when joined together made a chain linked so firm as to render it impossible for the person around whom it was formed to escape. Professor Taylor's forensic testimony proved particularly effective. He confirmed human blood on the knives, explained coagulation and dilution patterns in the clothing, and opined on the time required for dismemberment. He noted the surprisingly small quantity of blood would be expected for cuts made after death, when blood flows but does not spurt. Critically, he stated the recovered knives were too small to have severed Fanny's limbs. A larger weapon must have been used. Minnie Warner was carried into court to testify due to her young age. At trial, her greeting to Baker differed from the inquest. She now said he greeted them, "Ah, my little tulips, what are you playing at?" The defense strongly challenged her identification, noting the inconsistencies and her initial failure to identify Baker. This was the weakest link in the prosecution's chain. The defense offered a confusing double plea, not guilty, but also guilty and insane, arguing simultaneously that the prosecution hadn't proved Baker did it, but if the jury believed he had, they should acquit on insanity grounds. Samuel Carter presented evidence of Baker's family history, his father's homicidal mania, his cousin's 4 asylum commitments, his sister's death from brain fever, another relative currently institutionalized, and Baker's own suicide attempt after a failed love affair. Witnesses testified Baker had been a weakly, nervous child. The defense argued the diary entry was typical of the epileptic or formal way of entry Baker used, and that absence of a comma after killed didn't make it a confession. They correctly noted the small knives couldn't have dismembered Fanny. Carter pleaded that the murder itself, in its motiveless atrocity, was evidence of insanity. What sane man would commit such a crime, record it in his diary, and then behave so coolly? Justice Meller invited the jury to consider a verdict of not responsible because of insanity, suggesting they might find the prisoner irresponsible for his actions through insanity, a rare judicial indication that he saw merit in the defense. The jury retired at 7:05 in the evening on Friday, December 6th, taking Baker's diary with them. They returned in just 15 minutes with a verdict: guilty. The jury was apparently unimpressed by the insanity defense and rejected the judge's guidance. Justice Meller donned the black cap and pronounced sentence: hanged by the neck until you be dead. The speed of the verdict suggested the jury believed the evidence overwhelming and found Baker's actions, however horrific, the product of evil rather than madness. Over the following weeks, determined campaigns by Baker's supporters and several newspapers sought a reprieve on insanity grounds. The Spectator published a thoughtful editorial December 14, 1867, noting serious doubts are entertained of his sanity and arguing the act itself, in its motiveless atrocity, is not that of a sane man, and the entry of the murder in the prisoner's own diary can be explained on no theory except that of insanity. But the newspaper acknowledged Baker's fellow clerks saw no insanity in him, and that he knew right from wrong, the Victorian legal standard for criminal responsibility. All campaigns for reprieve failed. The execution was set for December 24, 1867, Christmas Eve. In his final weeks at Winchester Prison, Baker's behavior changed dramatically from his time in Alton, where he had been disturbed in his sleep and physically shuddered at the sight of meat. At Winchester, he became talkative with wardens, especially the chaplain. Bizarrely, he insisted his conscience was clear concerning the murder and wondered who the guilty party was, hoping he would be found. He ate and slept well, and spent his last weeks studying Scripture. Baker eventually made a full confession. He wrote a contrite letter to George Adams, expressing his sorrow for what he had done in an unguarded hour and seeking forgiveness. He claimed he murdered Fanny only because she would not stop crying, insisting it was done without malice aforethought and without pain or struggle. He assured the grieving parents he had not sexually molested Fanny, though contemporary observers and modern analysts believe this was likely a final lie. The letter was signed, "From a guilty but repentant culprit, Frederick Baker." George Adams reportedly returned a consolatory message. The morning of December 24th, 1867, Baker dressed himself in his clerk's garb and bizarrely donned his tall hat before enjoying a final hearty breakfast. The Aldershot Military Gazette reported he had been rather attentive to his dressing and wore a well-brushed black hat. At 8 o'clock sharp, 5,000 people gathered outside Winchester Prison for the execution, a massive crowd that had been arriving throughout the night to secure good viewing positions. The crowd's composition was notable. A large proportion consisted of women, including some hundreds of working class of Winchester, as many by early trains from Portsmouth and Southampton, a few shopkeepers, a large proportion of women, and a few nondescripts. Baker was led from his cell, along corridors, and across the courtyard to the pinioning room, where he was secured to a chair. The Aldershot Military Gazette described the scene. He walked steadily enough, and while somewhat pensive, did not manifest any particular emotion. From there, he went unassisted upstairs to the scaffold on the prison roof, taking his place under the beam. The executioner was William Calcraft, notoriously known as Short Drop Calcraft. Throughout his 45-year career executing approximately 450 people, Calcraft used a short drop method of approximately 18 inches to 2 or 3 feet insufficient to break the neck, causing death by slow strangulation over 3 to 4 minutes, rather than instant death from a broken neck. Baker stood on the drop while Calcraft covered his face and secured the rope. The chaplain finished the service, leaving Baker alone for several terrible moments. Witnesses reported the wretched man quivered from head to foot. Warders stretched out their hands to support him, but as they did, the bolt was drawn. Baker dropped and began the slow death by strangulation, kicking and writhing for 3 to 4 minutes before ceasing to exist. This was the last public execution held at Winchester Prison. The Capital Punishment Amendment Act abolishing public executions would be passed just 5 months later, on May 29, 1868. Following execution, Baker's death mask was made. The following year, 1868, his full figure was placed as an exhibit in the Chamber of Horrors at Madame Tussaud's famous waxworks in London, ensuring the case remained in public consciousness. Alton in 1867 represented the Victorian ideal of a peaceful, law-abiding market town. With a population of approximately 4,000 to 4,700, the town's economy centered on hop growing and brewing, drawing on the superior quality water from the River Wey. 2 breweries had been established, and Saturday markets dating back to 1232 continued to draw people from surrounding villages. Contemporary sources emphasize that Alton had previously seen no serious crime during the 19th century, and certainly none of the inhabitants could recall a local murder during their lifetime. The murder shattered this innocence utterly. The Standard newspaper observed on August 29, 1867, "The neighborhood of Alton, that pleasant little market town of Hants, will henceforth possess a dreary fame." The case catapulted this unassuming Hampshire market town into the national spotlight, creating a wave of horror, revulsion, and pity, and sensational headlines across England and beyond. The Adams family exemplified working-class Victorian life. George Adams worked as a bricklayer for local builders J.H. Dyers, who would later make Fanny's headstone. Harriet took in laundry to supplement the family income. They lived in Tanhouse Lane, in a close-knit neighborhood where Fanny's grandparents lived next door, where children played freely in nearby meadows, and where people knew their neighbors' business. The family attended church, George played cricket for the bell ringers, and the children were known and watched over by the community. This social fabric provided both the investigation's foundation, neighbors organized searches, provided testimony, guarded George Adams from revenge, and its greatest failure, Mrs. Gardner's deference to Baker's respectability allowed him to walk free after confrontation, potentially giving him time to better conceal evidence. Victorian class structure played a crucial role. A solicitor's clerk occupied an ambiguous, lower-middle-class professional position, not genteel, but respectable. Baker's appearance reinforced this. The black frock coat, tall hat, and position opposite the Swan Hotel marked him as someone to be treated with deference. When Mrs. Gardner confronted him, his air of respectability impressed the women, and when he told them that he was a clerk of a local solicitor, William Clement, they allowed him to leave. This deference to class markers nearly allowed a murderer to escape. The community response demonstrated both solidarity and vengefulness. Hundreds participated in searches the day after the murder. A public subscription raised funds for Fanny's headstone, completed in 1874. Yet the same community formed lynch mobs, requiring heavy police protection at every stage of Baker's journey through the justice system. The near lynching reflected a breakdown of social order and rule of law. In the face of extreme horror, vigilante justice nearly prevailed over legal process. Fanny was buried the afternoon of Sunday, August 25, 1867, presided over by Reverend W. Wilkins. The Alton Parish Register recorded her death with an unusual footnote: cruelly murdered by Frederick Baker. Her grave in Alton Cemetery would become a pilgrimage site. The headstone, erected by public subscription in 1874, bears the inscription, "Sacred to the memory of Fanny Adams, aged 8 years and 4 months, who was cruelly murdered on Saturday, August 24, 1867. Fear not them which kill the body, but are not able to kill the soul, but rather fear him which is able to destroy both soul and body in hell." Matthew 10, verse 28. This stone was erected by voluntary subscription. The biblical verse provided comfort while implicitly condemning the murderer, typical of Victorian religious frameworks for understanding evil. The grave remains well maintained and visited today. The Adams family moved away from Alton after the murder. Harriet Adams refused to ever return. George Adams eventually came back in his old age when living in Farnham Workhouse, a poignant end for a man who had nearly killed Baker in vigilante rage that terrible night. The Fanny Adams case received extraordinary media coverage, demonstrating how Victorian society consumed crime as entertainment and moral instruction. Local papers, the Hampshire Chronicle and Hampshire Telegraph, provided detailed, graphic coverage of the inquest, trial, and execution. National papers, including The Times, Lloyd's Weekly Newspaper, and The Spectator, covered the case extensively. The Sydney Morning Herald ran a story headlined, "Atrocious Murder and Mutilation in Hampshire," on November 4, 1867, demonstrating international reach. The most sensationalistic coverage came from the Illustrated Police News, which published fairly graphic newspaper cartoons showing the discovery of Fanny's severed head on hop poles and other gruesome details. The Police News published a special Police News edition of the trial and condemnation of Frederick Baker from their offices at 275 Strand, London, effectively a true crime pamphlet, capitalizing on public appetite for sensational details. Newspaper coverage was remarkably graphic for the era, providing extensive forensic details. Fanny's head and legs had been severed and her eyes removed. Her eyes had been thrown into the nearby river. Her torso had been emptied and her organs scattered. The Hampshire Chronicle reported specific anatomical findings. Fanny's ear had been severed from the head, which had 2 large cuts from mouth to ear across the temple. There were 3 incisions on the left side of the chest and a deep cut on the left arm. Her right leg was torn from the trunk, and the whole contents of her pelvis and chest were completely removed. Yet coverage maintained Victorian moral frameworks, emphasizing the youth and innocence of the victim, while characterizing Baker as initially appearing respectable, but revealed as monstrous. Lloyd's Weekly described Fanny as a tall, comely, and intelligent girl who bore the appearance of being several years in advance of her age, language that both idealized childhood innocence and hinted at vulnerability. The Hampshire Chronicle repeatedly emphasized the girls were of respectable parents, marking class boundaries and suggesting deserving versus undeserving victims. Baker's diary entry was quoted repeatedly as evidence of cold-bloodedness. The casual juxtaposition of murder with weather observation struck Victorian readers as profoundly disturbing, suggesting either complete moral depravity or insanity. Execution ballads were composed and sold as broadsheets, cheap publications capitalizing on crime for entertainment and moral instruction. One surviving ballad begins, "You tender mothers, pray, give attention. To these few lines I will now relate. From a dreary cell, now to you I'll mention. A wicked murderer now has met his fate." These ballads were performed in streets and pubs, keeping the case in public consciousness. The case occurred during a period of heightened Victorian anxiety about child murder. By the late 1850s and 1860s, a supposed epidemic of infanticide had spread across the country. In 1866, Reverend Henry Humble expressed widespread panic, noting people would not pick up unfamiliar bundles in fear that a dead child with a woman's garter around its throat would be found. The contemporary press regularly reported sensational stories of unnatural, villainous parents, but the Fanny Adams case differed from typical infanticide poverty-driven mothers killing infants. This was a stranger abduction and murder of a school-age child by a respectable professional man, making it more terrifying because it couldn't be dismissed as a problem of the poor or fallen women. The case challenged Victorian certainties about respectability as protection, community safety, children's freedom, and social class boundaries. The extensive press coverage, graphic details, and execution spectacle contributed to moral panic about child safety that would persist for generations. The fact that Baker had told Mrs. Gardner he gave money to children, which I often do, suggested potential previous victims, though none were identified. The cultural legacy of the Fanny Adams murder extends far beyond the crime itself, creating one of the most unusual linguistic phenomena in English, a murdered child's name becoming permanent slang, meaning nothing at all. In 1869, exactly 2 years after the murder, the Royal Navy introduced new rations of tinned mutton from the Navy Victualling Office. The tinned meat was unpopular, described as absolutely disgusting and almost inedible. Sailors, with characteristic dark humor, declared the contents must be the butchered remains of sweet Fanny Adams, a reference every sailor would have understood, as the case had dominated newspapers for 5 months during 1867. A rumor circulated that a sailor found a button in a tin and suggested it came from Fanny's clothing. The phrase Fanny Adams became Royal Navy slang for the tinned mutton. The large tins themselves became known as fannies and were repurposed as mess tins. To this day in the Royal Navy, mess tins and cooking pots are still called fannies, a direct linguistic legacy of the 1867 murder. The phrase evolved through predictable stages, from meaning bad tinned meat to mediocre mutton, then to stew and scarce leftovers, eventually to anything worthless or nothing at all. By 1889, the phrase appeared in print in Barrère and Leland's A Dictionary of Slang, Jargon, and Cant. By the mid-20th century, Sweet Fanny Adams became a common minced oath, a euphemistic alternative for a profane phrase meaning nothing whatsoever. The phrase Sweet F.A. emerged as shorthand, with the initials coincidentally matching those of the profane phrase. This created a dual meaning, the original reference to Fanny Adams and a euphemism for profanity. The phrase remains widely used in British English today to mean nothing at all or nothing of value, often abbreviated to Sweet F.A. It has recently crossed into American urban slang in its obscene capacity. Most users don't know its origin, yet they perpetuate the name of an 8-year-old murder victim from 1867, a bittersweet and ironic immortality. Alton today markets itself around multiple historical attractions. Its connection to Jane Austen, who lived nearby in Chawton, the Battle of Alton in 1643, and the Fanny Adams case, the Curtis Museum, founded in 1865 by Dr. William Curtis, maintains a permanent exhibition on the notorious tale of Sweet Fanny Adams, described as one of the museum's key attractions alongside the famous Alton buckle and Battle of Alton artifacts. The museum's local studies area houses extensive collections of press cuttings, articles, and historical documents available for research. Tony Rice authored Sweet Fanny Adams Revisited, What's in a Name, published in Alton Papers No. 20, available from the Curtis Museum. The museum faces ongoing funding challenges threatened with closure in 2010 and 2026, but continues operating with volunteer help. Flood Meadow, the murder site, remains mostly unchanged, despite surrounding housing developments. It is still used by local dog walkers and families, a quiet memorial to the place where innocence ended on an August afternoon. The Swan Hotel still stands where Baker drank on the evening of the murder. Historical walking tours include sites associated with the case. Fanny's grave remains well maintained in Alton Cemetery on Old Odiham Road. Visitors regularly come to see it. Historic photographs show Fanny's younger sister Lizzie and friend Minnie Warner at the grave in later years, two women forever marked by that afternoon when their friend was taken. The 150th anniversary in 2017 generated significant media coverage, with local newspapers including the Alton Herald and Farnham Herald publishing commemorative articles. The renewed public interest demonstrated the case's ongoing cultural relevance. Multiple books examine the case. Peter Cansfield's The True Story of Fanny Adams, published in 2004. Keith McCloskey's Killed a Young Girl. It Was Fine and Hot, The Murder of Sweet F.A. from 2016. And William Green's Trial of Frederick Baker, Drawing on Home Office Files. Academic papers explore the case from perspectives including Victorian crime, media sensationalism, language evolution, and gender studies. The case appears frequently in Victorian studies programs, criminology and forensic history courses, media studies examining sensationalism, and etymology classes. Podcasts, including The Tragic Tale of Sweet Fanny Adams and The Land of Odd, a history podcast, continue examining the case for modern audiences. Notably, the case did not lead to direct changes in child protection laws. Victorian England already had laws against murder and child harm, but the legal system focused on punishment rather than prevention. Significant reforms to child protection didn't occur until the 20th century. However, the case did contribute to growing Victorian awareness of child vulnerability and would be cited in later reform movements. The Fanny Adams case remains unique in how a horrific tragedy transformed into a permanent linguistic marker, ensuring that while the origins are largely forgotten, the name lives on in everyday speech. The case offers documentary filmmakers a complete narrative: innocence destroyed, methodical investigation, pioneering forensics, dramatic trial, public execution, and lasting cultural impact that continues 158 years later. Every time someone says Sweet Fanny Adams or Sweet F.A., meaning nothing at all, they unknowingly speak the name of an 8-year-old girl who was murdered on a fine, hot Saturday in August 1867 in a Hampshire hop garden, her name preserved in the language by sailors' dark humor and the perverse immortality of notoriety. If you found this investigation compelling, please subscribe to Cold Case Desk for more deep dives into historical true crime cases. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload. And if you appreciate the hours of research that went into bringing you this story, please consider hitting the like button. It genuinely helps us continue producing these documentaries. Leave a comment below telling us what you think about the Fanny Adams case. Did Victorian justice serve its purpose? How does this case reflect attitudes about class, childhood, and safety in that era? We read every comment and love hearing your perspectives. Thank you for watching Cold Case Desk. Until next time, stay curious about history's unsolved mysteries and forgotten tragedies.